Good afternoon. I'm so delighted to see so many people here this afternoon. I'm Jill Erickson. I'm head of reference and adult services at the Falmouth Public Library. And I thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for a very exciting event. We know we are very excited. Thanks too very much to FCTV for actually streaming live today and recording this event. So we're very pleased with that as well. We'd like to thank the library's Board of Trustees who make all of our author events and adult programs possible. And if you have not yet picked up a Books and Authors flyer, they are out on a table. There are more events coming this fall, so take a look. And we'd also like to thank, of course, Tess for agreeing to visit our library today to celebrate the release of her new book. We're thrilled beyond words. Tess will be signing her books in the trustees following her talk, and Eight Cousins is selling books should any of you need a book after the talk. And here's a little introduction about Tess. Tess Gerritsen is the internationally best-selling and award-winning author of over 25 books published in 40 countries, with more than 30 million copies sold around the world. At the age of 7, Tess knew she wanted to write. She fell in love with reading mystery novels at her neighborhood library in San Diego as a child, but it wasn't until she was on maternity leave that she finished her first romantic suspense novel, Call After Midnight, in 1987. Her first medical thriller, Harvest, was published in 1996 and marked her debut on the New York Times bestseller list. Tess is now retired from medicine and writes full-time, occasionally making time for organic farming, playing the fiddle, and screenplay writing. Her series of novels featuring homicide detective Jane Rizzoli and medical examiner Maura Isles inspired the TNT television series Rizzoli and Isles. Her new book, released this past August, is I Know a Secret, the 12th book in her series. Please give a round of applause to today's author, Tess Gerritsen.
Thank you so much. Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you so much. And I am really, really so happy to have had a chance to come down to Falmouth on a beautiful sunny day. I live in Maine, so it wasn't that long of a trek, but it's great to get out of the woods every so often. So I thought I would start off by just addressing the question that a lot of people always ask, which is, why do you write this kind of fiction? You know, are you crazy? Is there something scary about you? Or as my husband often gets this question, how do you dare sleep with her at night? And the answer is, it's my mother's fault. My mom was an immigrant from China, and she loved the American horror film because she could understand horror films. They're very visual. So when I was a kid, she took me to every scary movie that Hollywood ever made. And I spent my childhood screaming in movie theaters and learning that the height of entertainment was to terrify your audience. So that was one thing. But there was something that's a little more serious, and that was when I was young, I was exposed to a homicide case. We had a very, very beloved family friend. I'll just call him Uncle Joe. And he was the son of one of my mother's very good friends. So he was visiting our house all the time. I looked at him as a father figure, the kindest, sweetest, gentlest man I knew. And when I turned 18, he was arrested for murdering his sister-in-law. He tortured her and he drowned her in the toilet. And I remember thinking, I never saw this coming. I just never imagined that somebody I knew and loved could do something like that. And I think a lot of the reason I write mystery novels is I'm trying to answer that question. Who is the real person behind the smiling face? I mean, you'll never get an answer to that, but it's my attempt to answer that with every single novel I write. In a way, that's the same theme of every mystery novel, is which smiling face in the room hides the monster. So that probably is what inspired me to write the kind of genre that I do. I mean, most of mine involve murder mysteries. Even my romantic suspense ones do. So I'm always trying to answer that question. Now, the other thing that people always want to know is, where do you get your ideas from? I mean, some of these books I write are really pretty freaky. They cover subjects that are twisted, and it's not that I am twisted, it's just that I get ideas actually from the real world. And here's an example. To get ideas, I read a lot of newspapers, I pay attention to the news, I pay attention especially to true crime. And there was one story I read in the Boston Globe. It was years ago, and it was in the suburbs. And it wasn't really a crime story, but it was one that made me sit up and take notice. And let's see if you have the same reaction I did, because I always find that if something makes me go, oh my God, that's a book. So here's the story. Young woman was found dead in a bathtub with empty pill bottles beside her. And the police came and said, clearly an accidental overdose. So they zipped her into a body bag, and they sent her to the morgue. And a couple of hours later, she woke up. Yeah, okay, you have, right. I knew you were going to do that, because that's what I did. And I thought, oh my God, first of all, I didn't think at first this is a great book. I thought, as a human being, how often does this happen? So I did a search online for, my search term was mistaken for dead. And I was very disturbed to see how often this happens. That 1 year that I did the search, there was a kid who his death certificate had just been signed when the nurse noticed he was breathing. There was a young man hit by a car in Atlanta, spent the night in the morgue refrigerator when somebody heard him moving. My literary agent, who grew up in Nantucket, said, oh, when I was growing up, that used to happen a lot. I said, why? And she said, her explanation was they had a retirement home or a nursing home there where the medical director was deaf. And so he'd get called in to certify that Mrs. Jones had passed away. And he put the stethoscope on the chest, and he wouldn't hear the heart. And Mrs. Jones would be declared dead and sent to the morgue. So she said she remembers as a child that it happened 3 times in 1 year. And Nantucket used to call it the house of rejuvenation, the morgue. So the worst story I came across was in New York City, 1970s. Man was on the autopsy table. Doctor was about to cut him open, and the man woke up. And the doctor was so shocked he had a heart attack and died. So anyway, so you see these stories, and these are true stories. These are stories life is weirder than anything I come up with. But immediately, as a writer, you think, corpse wakes up in morgue. There's a story here. This is like the beginning of a novel. Now, depending on what genre you write, you will take that idea and put it in different directions. So if you were to write horror novels, you would say the corpse is a zombie, or you would say the corpse is a vampire, right? And that would be your horror novel. If you're writing spy novels, you would say, well, that's Jason Bourne, and he's faked his death, and this is how he's going to get away. And the way I used it was, I have a medical examiner in my series called Dr. Maura Isles. She's at work at night in the morgue. She hears a noise. She opens up a body bag, and the corpse inside opens her eyes. And so Maura calls 911, and this corpse ends up going to the hospital, where it does something nobody expects. The woman, who's now back to life, kills the security guard and takes hostages inside the hospital. It becomes a hostage crisis. Nobody knows who she is. Nobody knows why she's doing this. She hasn't said a word, but she's taking hostages. And among the hostages she's taken is a very pregnant homicide detective whose water has broken, who's in active labor, is in her little hospital gown. Nobody knows she's a cop. And now she's about to have the worst childbirth ever because she's in a hostage situation. So that was how I took it. But it all started off with some little article in the Boston Globe. So that's why I love to read things like the National Enquirer, People magazine, because that's where you get all these really weird stories, and you find lots of stories in there. So that's number one for how to find ideas as a thriller novelist. Pay attention to the news, read newspapers, read magazines, listen to conversations. You get stories that spark ideas. Maybe it's not the whole plot, but it's the idea that gets you going. The other thing that I think we writers have in common is we're all very curious people. We have a lot of interests. And I follow my interests because I find I get ideas from them. And one of them came from a long-term interest I had since I was in college. Now, even though I'm a medical doctor, my major was anthropology. And I loved Egyptology in particular, and especially the science of mummies. I thought mummies were the most fascinating thing. And over the years, I had been corresponding with an archaeologist who has an organization called the Mummy Consortium. And this Mummy Consortium has one project in mind, and that is they want to make sure that every Egyptian mummy in the United States gets a CAT scan. We have about 400 to 500 mummies in this country. A lot of them came to the US, I mean, not only through museums, but during the Victorian era when travelers wanted a souvenir in Egypt. So they would buy a mummy and ship it home. So you find mummies in strange places, in people's attics, in antique stores. And in fact, King Ramses the Great, his father, guess where he ended up? In a, believe it or not, in Niagara Falls. So these mummies, even royal mummies, end up in strange places. Anyway, one day, this Egyptologist said, we're gonna do a CAT scan on a mummy. You want to come watch? So I drove down to Poughkeepsie, helped them load the mummy from the local museum into a white van, and we drove it to the local hospital. Yes, they're scanned on the same hospital CT scans that patients are scanned on. So yeah, we wheeled it through the lobby. It was kind of a patient who had been 2,000 years. It was too late, but we get it to the CAT scan room, and as they're getting the CAT scan going, I'm paying attention to the dialogue that's going around me. The people are talking, and I heard that it took months for them to arrange the CAT scan of this mummy. The museum wanted to do it. The doctors wanted to do it. The X-ray department was so excited about scanning a mummy, and the reason it took months was the hospital lawyer. The hospital lawyer said, we have to abide by HIPAA rules in this country, and our HIPAA rules demand patient confidentiality. Besides, nobody can sign the consent form. So the way they arranged it was the museum declared themselves as the parents. And so they were about to start the CAT scan, and I'm a doctor, okay, but I didn't realize that before you can start a CAT scan, you have to put in all this patient information. Otherwise, the program doesn't start. And the first thing they needed was the patient's age. So they put in 2,000 years, because that was accurate, and the machine wouldn't start. So they made the patient a day old, and then it said, what sex is this patient? And the CAT scan allows you 3 choices: male, female, and other. And the CAT scan technician said, please can we put other? I've never done that before. So the patient went in as a 1-day-old other patient. So we're watching the CAT scan. Probably most of you have had a CAT scan. It's like a cross-section, X-rays through your body. So we're going to the head, and you see the brain is gone. The brain has been evacuated, as you would have seen in a properly mummified person. And if you ever wondered how they did that, and you all know they punched a hole in the nose, they used to think that they stuck a hook up there and pulled the mummy down, pulled the brain down with this hook. And they cannot do that, because there is an Egyptologist who has tried to mummify somebody, and he said you can't do it because the brain texture is too crumbly and soft. It's like trying to get hold of tofu and pull it out the nose. You can't do it. So the new way that they think happened was that they put some kind of an instrument inside there and liquefied the brain in place. They probably broke it up, and then it was evacuated through that hole in the nose. We get down to the chest, and a little bit of heart is there, and the organs have been removed and dried and rewrapped in linen. But what was interesting was we get down to that thigh bone, and there's a horrible break in the femur with no signs of healing. So I thought, that's how this poor young man died. Maybe he fell off a horse or something and bled to death in his thigh. But here's where the writer's mind is a little different from everybody else's. I'm standing there thinking, oh, this is interesting, but what if we saw something that nobody was expecting? What if we saw something that shocked us all? What if we saw in this 2,000-year-old mummy a bullet deep in the muscle? What would that mean? It would mean it's not a 2,000-year-old mummy. So that became the basis of a book that I wrote called The Keepsake, about Maura Isles is watching a CAT scan of an ancient mummy, sees something that shouldn't be there, and calls up Jane and says, we got to have a modern homicide case here, and that starts off the story. But it was all because of, you cultivate these interests, you follow them, and you just never know that a story's going to come out of them. And just as a little addendum to that, after I wrote the book, I thought I was being so creative. And another Egyptologist friend said, yeah, well, it's already been done in real life. He had been called to consult on a mummy in India. The museum was about to buy a mummy there from a private party, but they were bothered by the condition of this mummy. They said there's something really wrong with this mummy. So he flew to India, looked at the CAT scan, and he said, indeed, there's something really wrong with this mummy. It's a young woman, and her teeth have been pulled out. And he said, I don't think this is an ancient mummy. I think this is a modern homicide victim. And I think the reason they pulled the teeth was to hide the fact she had dental work. And it did become an investigation, and they did catch people. So here I thought I was being really creative with my bad guys. No, no matter what I do, some horrible person has done it somewhere, sometime. So those are the kinds of things that you know, inspire you, whether it's interests or whether it's something you read. Sometimes it's travel, and I am a big proponent of travel being a source of amazing creative breakthroughs. I've had a couple of books that were born because of experiences I had overseas. I had my book Die Again was because of an experience I had on safari, a really scary experience. And then I had a book called Playing with Fire, that was born because I was in Venice and I had a nightmare. And this most recent book, I Know a Secret, which is number 12 in the Rizzolian Isles series, was also born because of a trip I took to Italy. I was in Italy on vacation, and like most tourists, I was dutifully visiting all the art museums, you know, looking at all the paintings. And after a while, I was getting really bored because the paintings, you know, these old masters' paintings, they very often deal with the same subject matter, and that's sacred. It's the sacred. It's religious art. So you see again and again, Madonna and child, you know, like 100 different renderings of Madonna and child. And you see sometimes a lot of saint pictures of the saints and various stories out of the Bible. So I was pretty tired of this until I picked up a book in Florence that was written by an Englishman, and it was called How to Read a Painting. And it talked about how the old masters would use symbols in their art to tell you something, to explain something. It's sort of like these little secret codes that are in all these paintings. So for instance, if you were to see somebody holding a palm frond in a painting, you knew something about them. Even though you didn't know who they were, you knew that they died a martyr as a saint. The palm frond is a symbol of martyrdom. If you see a little dove, a little white dove in these paintings, you know that's the symbol of the Holy Spirit. And a lot of the saints who were martyred and died horrible deaths, you'll find them often portrayed with a symbol of their death. For instance, St. Lucy, and she comes up in this book. If you see a woman in a painting holding what looks like eyeballs in her hand, you know that's St. Lucy because she was tortured and her eyes were dug out before she died. And then if you see a woman holding an ointment pot, you know that is Mary Magdalene. So all these little things that tell you who these saints are you can find them in these paintings, and all of a sudden, art became more of a treasure hunt for me. So I would like rush to the next church to go look at the paintings because it was like looking for Easter eggs, you know. Oh, that's Saint Sebastian. Oh, look at that. That's, you know, and so you begin to find that these paintings hold a lot more than just images. They hold messages. They hold stories. And now here's the writer coming into the story. I'm looking at these and thinking, well, these painters, it's so interesting, the stories they're telling. And then I thought, what if a killer did that? What if a killer used a crime scene the way a painter uses a painting? Inserts symbols there, has things about his death scene that are a message. They tell a story, and they're meant for one recipient in particular, but you don't know who this recipient is for these messages. So that's part of what starts off I Know a Secret, in which Jane and Maura come across a crime scene. And in the crime scene, they find a young woman who is a horror film producer who's dead. Although she looks like she could be asleep. She's lying very peacefully on her bed. And the only reason they know that this is probably a murder is that she's holding her eyeballs in her hand. And so, but Jane and Maura, they're looking at this and thinking, we have some sicko who's doing this. But what Maura is most bothered by is not that. What bothers her most is that she cannot figure out how this woman died, because this was all done post-mortem. How did anybody kill this woman? She can't find she can't find enough drugs in there. She can't find any reason for this woman to be dead. So this is the big mystery for Maura, is how does this woman get killed? And then shortly thereafter, there's another crime scene. And the second crime scene is of a young man who's lying dead with arrows sticking out of his chest. But again, these arrows were post-mortem. And Maura can't figure out how this young man died, and is there a connection? So that's the basic mystery behind I Know a Secret. But there's another part of I Know a Secret that, there are two more things. One of them is sort of fun. One of them has to do with the horror film industry. Now, I told you how I love horror films. Well, and I mentioned that the first victim is a horror film producer. My son and I made a horror film last year. Yeah. I wrote the script and he directed, and it's called Island Zero. And that whole experience of making an independent horror film, juggling actors and film crew and filming outdoors in the cold. And we finished the film. It's already been in a couple film festivals. But that experience of that whole world of indie horror is in here as well. And I love horror fans. They look scary, but they're not. They're the sweetest people. And incidentally, I found out that I believe somebody said a majority of horror fans are women. They're not men, they're women. So just like me. But there's one other part of this story that comes up that's quite a bit more serious, and that has to do with a criminal justice case that happened in San Diego, which is where I grew up. And I had heard about this back in the 90s, and this is another reason I wrote this book. There was a man named Dale Akiki. He was born with a congenital malformation on his face, so he was kind of a scary-looking young man, but he was kind. Everybody loved him, and he was an ardent churchgoer. He loved his church. He volunteered to be a school teacher, a Sunday school teacher. So when the parents were there at church, their 3- and 4-year-olds were at the Sunday school classroom, just right down the hall, and Mr. Akiki was watching them. So he did this for a couple of years. The kids all adored him. And then something happened. One of the parents called the police and said, I think Mr. Akiki has sexually molested my son. And the way the police handled it was they wrote letters to the other parents and said, it's possible that this man molested your child. Talk to your child and come to us if there are any issues. So the parents began to ask their 3- and 4-year-old kids, did he do this to you? Did he do that to you? And of course they began to get stories. And the stories that came back were pretty weird. One was, Mr. Kiki took us out on a boat and killed a shark. And Mr. Kiki killed babies. And Mr. Kiki killed a tiger. So these were the stories that the parents were getting, but it was enough for the prosecutor to decide to take this to court. So Dale Akiki spent, I believe, 20 months in prison awaiting trial. And what's interesting is that the first people who were absolutely certain of his innocence were the other inmates. They saw this man, they said, he did not do this, and they protected him in the entire time he was in prison. The other inmates banded around to protect this man. It was the longest trial in San Diego history, and in the end, the jury decided he was innocent because they were given access to the questioning of these children was all videotaped, and they could see how this questioning was done. And it was only later that it was discovered the original mother who made the accusation was schizophrenic, and was unable to. She was not in touch with reality. So he suffered, this imprisonment. He was eventually released, and in fact, when he was sent home in a stretch limousine that was paid for by the police. So I read that story, and I was shocked that something like this would go to prosecution when the stories were so ridiculous, and there were no physical findings of molestation, and the stories were so outrageous. But then I began to read about what was called at the time satanic ritual abuse. And this, it turned out, was something that was sweeping the country. During that period, the late 80s all the way up to the early 90s, there were multiple cases of this going to court, usually having to do with daycare centers. And there was a famous one that was the longest case in U.S. history of a family with their staff who had a daycare center. And again, it was one mother who made the accusation. Again, the kids were interrogated. Luckily, it was all videotaped. And again, the stories that came out from the children were, he flew a broom around the room. He killed babies and he flushed them down the toilet into the secret room. On all, all these sort of wild tales that never turned out to be true. And these people ended up, I think it was years and years of having to go through this trial before they were finally deemed innocent. And again, it was a mother who was mentally ill who made the initial accusation. So it became known as a satanic ritual abuse, I guess, insanity or fear. And it was happening not just in the US, but it was happening abroad as well. And it was only in that really small period of time, 10 years, when everybody believed this was happening. But a large part of the problem was, how much do you believe the recollections of children? How much should we believe? I'm a grandmother, and I have 2 granddaughters, one of whom is almost 4. And if I were to tell you the things that she told me, you would think, children, you have to be very, very careful about what they're telling you. And she would be perfectly, she would insist to the end of the world that this tiger came flying in her room. So you have to be careful. But the other thing that came up is the question of false memory syndrome. And false memory syndrome, it was only recently, I think, described by a psychologist named Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who did a study on adults. This is adults. I think they were mostly college students. And her study went like this. She, as soon as they volunteered, she got access to their parents and asked the parents, can you tell me 3 incidents of your of your daughter or son's childhood that they would remember? 3 probably traumatic things that happened. And the parents came up with the stories. And so Dr. Loftus would type up those 3 incidents and would add a 4th one that was not true, and gave it to these college students and said, can you describe these things that happened in your childhood? And by the end of a couple weeks, most of these subjects could describe in great detail everything, including the thing that never happened to them, and believed it. And so 25% of these students came away absolutely convinced that this fictional incident happened to them. Those are the people in which she had implanted a false memory. So knowing how unreliable my own memory is and other people's memories, a lot of prosecutors will tell you eyewitness is probably the worst evidence of all. And that comes up in this story as well, because I'll just tell you one more thing before I go to questions. I am a victim of false memory syndrome as well. Now, remember I told you about that case of the family friend who killed his sister-in-law? Well, for years afterwards, I remembered the day he killed her, he came to visit us and looked perfectly ordinary. He just seemed the same as always. He was cheerful. He brought cookies. He sat with us. And I would have sworn to you that I saw that happening. And then I was asked to do an article about that case. And I went back and looked at the San Diego Union Tribune newspapers. And I realized that the day he did it, I was in college. I was hundreds of miles away on a university campus. I could not have been there that day. And the reason I swore that it happened to me was because I'd heard my mother talk about it again and again. And she talked about it so vividly that I just assumed I was there. So I know that it's easy to implant a false memory in me too. So I think that if you were to put me on a witness stand, I would have sworn that was true, that I was there. Anyway, it's a reminder for us all that we need to be careful about believing eyewitnesses, that sometimes through no fault of their own, just because we are so amenable to have our memories rearranged, that we can put innocent people in prison, and children can as well. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's happening next, because I'm going to leave some time for questions. So what's happening now is, I'm sorry to say this, but this may be the last Rizzoli and Isles book. Yeah. Part of it is that I sort of feel like I've come to the natural conclusion of the series. I've tied up a lot of loose ends in their personal lives. You'll find out about what happens to some of the characters whose lives were kind of left hanging in the last book. And also, I'm working on other projects right now. I'm working on a thriller novel right now that I may be publishing under a different name because it is a thriller that may or may not involve a ghost. So if you love that story, The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, well, this is The Ghost of Mrs. Muir plus murder plus sex. So the other thing that is happening is my son and I are now working on another film. We're working on a documentary about the long, long ancient history of the relationship between humans and pigs. Yeah, pigs, the animal pig. And it's going to be called Pig. But the reason for this is I was in Turkey during Ramadan one year, and I really was hungry for bacon. And yeah, I was wondering, why don't they eat this tasty meat? What is it with pigs in the Middle East? Why did pigs become forbidden food? It became a puzzle for me, and I began to ask people, and nobody had the same answer. I mean, I know we think that they're unclean and everything to do with their stomachs and their hooves, but what's the real reason so many people don't eat pork? Now, I'm Chinese, and the Chinese, of course, we adore pork. We love pork. We eat everything. You can't forbid a food to us, because then we'll just eat more of it. But why do certain religions forbid certain foods? So that became a question that my son and I wanted to investigate. And then the story kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger. So now it's about pigs and humans in general. And we've had a chance to interview some fascinating people. We've had a couple of archaeologists. We're going to England in a couple of weeks to interview the world's experts on pig genetics. Did you know they're all in England? I didn't know pig genetics experts were all in England. We've interviewed, of course, a couple of chefs, an expert in feral swine in the United States. I mean, the wild pigs are everywhere. And we've also interviewed a couple of pig owners, and that has been the most interesting, because what kind of a person has a pet pig? Yes, right? Right, well, that's one. But we've interviewed one woman who, this is the most spoiled pig in the world. It's this giant potbelly pig that's so overweight, it's now on a diet. But this pig has its own elevator, because it needs to get up to her bedroom to go to bed. And then we have, so anyway, the stories are turning out to be more, the people are much more fun to interview than the pigs themselves. But, it's really about how do we react to pigs. So that's one of the tales that we're following up. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, so I'm going to ask you to ask me something that I've never heard before. Yes. Okay, how do I apply medical knowledge to my stories? And this is an interesting thing, that my first 9 books did not use medicine. I started off writing romantic suspense novels that did not have any medicine in them. And the reason for that is I thought that working day to day as a doctor, that what I did was kind of boring. I thought, who cares about what happens in a hospital? But then I got an idea for a book from a conversation. I was having dinner with a homicide detective, and he told me that he would have been traveling in Russia, and he said that children were disappearing from the streets of Moscow, and the police there thought the kids were being kidnapped and sent off to the Middle East as organ donors, cut open and their organs removed and the kids murdered. So I was really shocked by that idea, and clearly that was not going to be a romantic novel. So weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I thought, this is my next book. So I wrote Harvest, and it was my first time on the bestseller list, and I was kind of surprised. I thought, wow, people really do care about medicine. My literary agent said, yes, people want to know secrets. They want to know things that doctors know that they don't want to tell us. And so that has always been, ever since then, I thought, I've been wrong about medicine. People do want to know secrets. And so I use medicine quite a bit, partly through my medical thrillers, obviously why, but with Maura Isles, she is the medical authority, and we hear about what it's like to think as a doctor. Jane Rizzoli is sort of our every woman who doesn't know all these medical terms, so she gets to ask the questions that we would normally ask a doctor. So I use medicine quite a bit. It doesn't mean I don't have to do a lot of research, because a lot of the stuff that gets in my books is not something I would know unless I picked up the phone and called somebody. The research aspect of it is actually the most fun of it for me. I wrote a book called Gravity about doctors on the International Space Station, and I got to do a lot of research about medicine and space. And I know people have asked me, how did you get NASA to do this with you? And the way I did it was I called up. I did a lot of research into NASA at first. And then I called up their public affairs officer in Houston. And I said, I'm a medical thriller writer, and I'm writing this thriller that takes place on ISS. Can you help me? And he said, what happens in your book? And I said, well, everybody dies on ISS except for my heroine. And he said, do you know what the purpose of my office is here? It's to make NASA look good. And he said, what else goes wrong in your story? And I said, well, a shuttle crash is killing everybody aboard. And he said, well, I don't think we want to cooperate. And I said, no, everything that goes wrong in this story is not your fault. NASA does everything right. And he said, well, who's the bad guy? And I said, it's the military. And he said, when would you like to come? So anyways, that's really, I think, the important part is getting the experts who want to talk to you, willing to talk to you, willing to tell you secrets. And I got a lot of secrets out of NASA on that trip. Yes?
Is there a reason there was only an story set in Boston?
Yes, I live in Maine. And when I wrote the very first book, which was The Surgeon, it was about a serial killer, and I wanted to have, I wanted it to have enough victims so that you would believe a serial killer was at work, and I live in Maine. So that was what really the issue. I wanted to have the closest major city to me so that I could drive back and forth to do research. It's funny, but I talked to he's a state police officer, a detective in Maine, and he said, we have had a couple serial killers in Maine. You don't know that. We've had a couple, but they all came from away. So really, I use Boston because it's the largest major city that would have a homicide unit of 12 people. Yes?
Did you ever have any of those strange experiences that you talked about as a medical examiner?
Oh, no. I mean, I was an internal medicine doctor, so I never worked as a medical examiner.
Did you know anybody at that time who had any
At
of
the
those
time,
strange-
they all have war stories. They all have really interesting war stories. I sometimes go to they have this retreat for forensic pathologists up in Colby College in Maine. So I go there every couple of years just to hang out with them. And I'm not sure I'm really free to talk about it, but they do tell stories, yes. My husband's a part-time medical examiner in our county in Maine. He doesn't do autopsies, but he looks at unattended deaths and helps decide whether they need to go to the actual forensic pathologist in Augusta. And it's sad, how many of the cases he attends to are suicides. We have a lot, and a lot of overdoses now. Yes?
So what made you switch from writing the medical thrillers from a doctor's point of view to introducing police?
Okay, why did I go from medical thrillers to crime thrillers? It was really because of the story of the first one was The Surgeon. And that was supposed to be a one-off book. I was never going to be a series. And that story it came about because I was thinking about medical thrillers. I was thinking about my next medical thriller and thinking, what bothers us about doctors? What bothers us as patients? I'm a patient too. And I thought, well, okay, this bothers me. Maybe it bothers you too. You go to get your blood drawn at a hospital or at a clinic. Do you ever wonder where that tube of blood goes? Who is in control of that tube of blood? Because that is the most intimate thing you're going to hand over to a stranger. Because that tube of blood tells secrets about you. It tells whether you're pregnant or you're a drug addict or if you smoked a cigarette or you have diabetes and all kinds of things you don't want anybody to know. And then I began to think about where that tube of blood ends up. It ends up in some lab somewhere. And what if there's somebody that works in that lab who's not quite right? Who takes this tube of blood, gets this tube of blood from a doctor's office across town and says, there's something about your tube of blood that makes me want to kill you. And because he may have access to medical records, he knows your name, your age, where you live, whether you're married, things like that. So that's how it all started, about the idea of blood being the reason we're targeted as a suspect, as a victim. So I wrote The Surgeon, and Jane Mazzoli appears in that book, but she's not the main character. She's a secondary character who was supposed to die in the story. That's why I didn't bother to make her likable, because I thought I was going to kill her. So when you see Jane Rizzoli in that first scene in The Surgeon, when she walks in, you think, oh my God, she's such a bitch. Nobody wants to follow Jane Rizzoli. She's not likable. But in the course of the story, I got to know her. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to her, so she sort of formed herself. And I thought, she's not particularly attractive, but she's really smart. She works harder than anybody else, and she is the one who really solves the crime. And when it came time to kill her, and you probably all know where that death scene is if you read the book, I couldn't do it. I let her survive, and then I thought, wow, what happens to you next? You're such an interesting woman, and I had learned to admire Jane by the end of the story. So I wrote the sequel, which was The Apprentice, and I introduced Maura Isles in the second book. And then I thought, well, she's sort of an interesting, scary, mysterious character. I want to know more about Maura, so I wrote a third book, The Sinner, and then I had a series. So nothing has ever been planned in the series. I never knew how long it would go. It's always been about following their lives and trying to find out what happens to them next. And a lot has happened to them. They start off as merely colleagues. They start to become friends. They have ups and downs. They have arguments. Sometimes they're barely talking to each other. But they both know that the other woman is the smartest person they know. And if they're going to trust a colleague, it's going to be her. So I think that's what made the TV show such a success. It's really, maybe it was the first TV show since Cagney and Lacey where it shows women in this trusting relationship with this confidence in each other, believing that, you know what, if I'm going to be facing a killer, I want her next to me, not anybody else. And so I think that especially women audiences appreciated that, because as a person in the medical, who worked in the medical field, most of my colleagues were women. And I always knew that the one person who was smartest in the hospital was probably that ER nurse downstairs. Yes?
How much involvement do you have in the production of Rizzoli and Isles? Are you happy with the way that they enter your novels?
The question was about what role I had in the television show. I really did not have a role. They had their own team of writers. The pilot episode was based on my book, The Apprentice, and there was one episode that was based on one of my short stories called John Doe. But they went in their own direction. And if you watch the TV show, you'll know that there are a lot of changes. There's a lot. First of all, I just described Jane Rizzoli to you. She's not attractive. She's ordinary looking. She's kind of messy. And then they cast beautiful Angie Harmon for that role. So now Jane Rizzoli is beautiful. And they also added a lot of humor to it. And they made a number of changes that I wish they hadn't made. For instance, I love the idea that Maura Isles' birth mother is in prison because she's a horrible murderer, because it gives more of a darkness to Maura. So they made some changes, but I can't argue with success. It went 7 years, and it went off the air at #1 on TNT. So it went out on top. And a lot of people have asked me, why did the show end? There were a couple reasons for it. A lot of it had to do with the demographics of its audience. They had a new program director come on to TNT, and advertised television really relies on your advertisers, who wants to buy commercials. And apparently advertisers are much more interested in young men between 18 and 25, or 18 and 35, and most of the viewers of Rizzoli and Isles and The Closer are women 45 and up. So we don't count. Yes?
Do you outline your books? And if you do a chapter at a time or the whole thing, do you know where you're going to end up before you start out?
I do not outline my books, and it leads to some really weird first drafts. I get the idea, and then I think, what happens next? And then I finish that chapter, and I think, what happens next? So it's a chaotic way of writing. I've tried outlining my stories, and every time I've done it, I've always thrown out the outline because the story sort of goes off in a different direction. So as an example, a couple things about my process. I do not stop to edit during the first draft. I never do. I just write to the end. Even if the book takes me in weird directions, I write with pen and paper, first draft, on unlined typing paper. Because if I were to work on a keyboard and saw my sentences on a screen, I would spend all day editing. because it turns on your editor if you see it on screen. But so as an example, the book I told you about the woman who wakes up in the morgue, when I first started that story, which eventually was published under the title Vanish, it was a man in the body bag. I had this idea. It was a man in the body bag. He wakes up. He takes hostages. And I got halfway through that manuscript. I mean, I'm already at 200 pages, word count. And I got writer's block. And this always happens to me. I always get writer's block. And I stopped because I didn't know what happened next. I didn't know who this man was, why he'd done this, how he ended up in the body bag, and what his motives are. I had no idea. And he was like the center of the story. So I do what I often do is I just put the book aside, walked away. I think I was stopped writing for about 2 weeks, and I had to go on this long drive in Texas. And drives really work. Driving a road that you don't have to pay a lot of attention to, that is really good for your creativity. So I'm driving to Texas and thinking, why am I bored? I'm so bored with this story. I don't want to write this story. And then all of a sudden, it's like this light bulb goes on. You know why you're bored by this story? It's a man in the body bag. And the reason I'm bored is that who takes hostages in this world? It's not women. It's men, right? It's always men. So it's very ordinary. It's a very ordinary situation. And I thought, in the middle of Texas, what if it was a woman? What if a woman took hostages? Then it becomes weird, and it becomes really interesting. It becomes a real puzzle. So I got home, and I didn't fix that first half. I left it the way it was, and I just started writing for the middle of the book as if it had always been a woman in that body bag. So, and then that's when you fix it up on the next draft. But if you were to read my first drafts, you would be really confused, because a man suddenly, from one page to the next, becomes a woman. But that is my technique, and I always tell young writers, don't worry about perfection first draft. Give yourself permission to write a really bad first draft, because that's what the revision process is about. Yeah. Have there been any drafts of books that I walked away from? When I started off, I did. Early on, until I learned this much about my process, which is every first draft looks terrible. Every first draft makes you want to quit writing for the rest of your life. And you just learn to power through that. You learn, I'll fix it later, I'll fix it later. Nora Roberts, who is probably the best-selling romance author in the world, she has this great quote that I always tell people. Her quote is, I can fix a bad page, but I can't fix a blank page. So it's really important to fill up those blank pages and then go back and fix them. Yeah?
Who are your favorite authors? Is it an author living or dead that you like?
Oh, okay. Who are my favorite authors, and is there an author living or dead whom I would like to meet? I read, because I'm doing more documentary stuff now. My favorite authors are all nonfiction. My dad was a restaurant chef, so I'm really into food, and my favorite author in the world is Michael Pollan. I love Michael Pollan, and I also love Anthony Bourdain. I mean, anything to do with food, and the thing about Michael Pollan is he takes the scientific aspect of it. He'll look at a plant, he'll look at the history of corn, and he'll tell you things that you never imagined. So yeah, those are two of my favorites. Living or dead, whom I'd like to meet? Oh, it's really funny. Authors in person are not that much fun. Because all our interesting stuff goes on the page, and we ourselves are not that interesting. But I guess I'd like to meet Mark Twain. Yes?
When you were writing Playing with Fire, how did you actually get the idea? You mentioned you went to Venice, but I
Yeah.
didn't read any of the Zolli and Isles books. I just saw the shows on TV. But when I went to pick up a book here to see what you were like, that's so different from
So different.
these stories that you have.
Yeah, I would love to talk about Playing with Fire, and I will. I have till what, right? Okay, because that story is something that I never planned to write. I never expected to write. It was a weird story. So Playing with Fire was born out of a nightmare I had in Venice. I was there for my birthday and had a couple of glasses of wine and went to bed and had this terrible dream. I'm an amateur violinist, and I dreamt I was playing my violin, and in the dream I knew I was playing something very dark and mysterious and beautiful. And there was a baby sitting next to me in this dream. And the baby's eyes glowed red, and she turned into a monster. And I woke up, and that was my nightmare. I thought, oh my God, what does this mean? You know, the power of music to turn children into horrible creatures. So I walked around Venice that day. I knew there was a story here, but I wasn't sure what the story was, and I couldn't figure out why I was having this dream. And I ended up in the old Jewish quarter in Venice. And in that, it's actually called the Ghetto Nuovo, the new ghetto, but it's actually the old ghetto. And they have these memorials to the 246 Jews who were deported during World War II. And I think all but 8 died in Poland. And one of the memorials is it's just this wooden plaque with the names and the ages of every victim. And I got to the bottom, and there was like a group of people with the last name Tedesco. And it was as if, I swear, it was as if somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, here's your story. What happened to the Tedescos? And so I wrote a story. The story is it's called Playing with Fire. It's about a woman violinist, modern day, who picks up in an antique store in Rome a handwritten piece of sheet music. And the sheet music is called Incendio. And all she knows is that the composer's name written on the side is El Tedesco. So she goes home and she plays it. And every time she plays it, her 3-year-old daughter goes berserk and does something horrible. And she thinks there's something evil about this music. So she wants to find out the history of this music. And nobody believes her because nobody's there to watch her daughter do these terrible things. And they begin to think she's crazy. And her husband wants to send her to a psychiatrist. But she feels that the key to what's going on that's destroying my family is the history of this music. So there is a parallel story that's told in this book that takes place in 1940s Venice. And you see the Tedescos. You see how Lorenzo Tedesco came to compose this piece of music, which in Italian is fire. What happens to the family? He's a wonderful violinist. He's a composer. And it's about his love story with a young woman cellist. And by the end, you find out what happened to the Tedescos, and you find out why Julia is having these horrible reactions to this music. And what the weird part about that story, I mean, I've already told you that it started with a nightmare, but the weird part of the story is I'm writing this book, and in order to write the book, I have to describe this music Incendio. And it doesn't exist, okay? It's just a fictional piece of music, and I'm writing about that it starts off as a waltz, and then it gets very frantic, and then it has a lot of what we call devil's chords, which are it's just an interval of music that's very hard on the ear. And halfway through writing this story, I had another dream, and I dreamt the melody of this music. And I woke up the next morning, it was in my head. So I sat down, and it took me about 6 weeks to compose it for piano and violin. So I composed this piece of music. And I sent it off to a music producer in London. And I said, I don't know what to do with this. What do you think? And he said, I know just the violinist to record this piece of music. So he contracted with a violinist named Suzanne Howe, who is a Toronto-based concert violinist who's traveled the world. And she was practicing the music, and she called me up one day from Paris, where she was living. I never met her. And she said, I just want to tell you that I am practicing your music Incendio right now with my windows open, and there's a crowd outside listening. So she recorded the music. It is available, and here's the weird part about it. So the story, the book was published, the music was published, the recording was published on iTunes. And after she read the book, she says, this is really scary, this is really weird, but in your book, your character, Lorenzo Tedesco, plays a violin that was made in Cremona 270 years ago. And I said, yeah. And she said, when I recorded your music, it was on a violin that was made in Cremona 270 years ago. So it's all these things that later on I just thought, oh my God, this is like really creepy. But it really is as if somebody said you have to write the story. So if you buy the book and you want to hear the music, you can get it you can either buy it on iTunes or Amazon, or you can actually just go to YouTube and hear Suzanne's recording of it. Just do a search for Incendio, spelled like the Spanish incendio, and Suzanne Howe's last name, H-O-U, and you can hear it. It's she added a wonderful cadenza to it as well. Yeah.
How do you decide on your
The title, okay, book titles. That's hard. And I have probably been responsible for half of my titles. Often they will go in with a title and my publisher goes, we can't use that title. That's awful. That's a terrible title. And then they will come up with a title. And sometimes my English publisher, which is a separate house, doesn't like the American title. So they'll put on a new title. So they're difficult because, number one, you want to be original. You also want to be specific to the story, but you also want to be catchy. And you don't want to get people upset. So, for instance, my book, I'm trying to think of it. It's called Ice Cold. My American title is Ice Cold. The English title is The Killing Place. And the reason the Americans didn't like The Killing Place is they said, oh, that will freak people out. That will freak American readers out. We can't use that title. So that's, you know, it's very market specific how they choose. And The Keepsake, okay, The Keepsake. We all know what a keepsake is, right? The English said, what does that word mean? It turns out they don't use that term. They've never heard of the keepsake. That's not a phrase they use. So they turned it to keeping the dead. Okay, one last one. Okay.
Based on the story you just told about how your nightmare, and also the fact that you were always reading in the newspapers looking for some ideas, and also lots of what you're reading is disturbing.
Yeah.
Do you find sometimes that you need to take a story and write it as in a therapeutic way so you can get it through your system, or does all this negative, grisly information bother you? How do you handle all something that's so disturbing to a reader?
I think, and this is interesting because I get asked this question, do you ever scare yourself? Because it's a little along those lines. Are you ever so disturbed that you scare yourself? I think of it as trying to tickle yourself. You can't, because you're in control. You know where this dark story is going, and you can pull back if you need to. And you have, when you're in control, it's as if you can somehow control the horribleness of it. And I'm also trying to craft sentences, and so I'm thinking about multiple things at once, and it's as if the horror doesn't really affect me as much as it would somebody who's just coming to the story as a reader. I remember writing a screenplay years ago that was made into a television movie called Adrift. And I wrote a scene about, I think I said, he takes her hand and he holds it over the flame to make her talk or something. And, you just write that down on a piece of paper and it goes into the script and you'll think about it. And then I saw the television show and I was horrified. I said, oh my God, I wrote that. That's terrible. So in a way, I think I'm not really as aware of the effect the words have on people because I'm looking at it as a manufacturer. I'm crafting it, but I'm not really thinking about the reaction to it. All right, one more. Sir.
Did you choose Maine for a particular reason why you retired there?
Why I retired there? Yeah.
I know where you live.
Yes.
Is it a therapeutic type thing for you also?
Well, I moved to Maine from Hawaii.
That's a big difference.
Right. I was living in Honolulu for 12 years. I'm from California. I'm a California girl. So I went to Hawaii for 12 years and I got rock fever. And I just needed to get off that island. As beautiful as Hawaii is, if you can't get off, you really, yeah. So we went to Maine on vacation one summer. And I stood on the landing in that particular little town I live in now. And I just thought, something tells me I need to be here. And we've been there for 27 years now. So no, we just love it. And there's something about Maine that is, we have, the Maine Chamber of Commerce, telling the truth or not, I don't know, claim that we have more writers per capita in our state than any state in the country. I think it's.
You live next to my cousin.
So you know how beautiful it is. It can be very lonely in the wintertime, which is really good for writers. And that we have long, long winters, which is also good for writers. Well, thank you very much.